Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for the final OKIO Labs webinar of IST20. I'm Michael from OKIO Labs. Tons of educators all over the world have greatly benefited from OKIOCAM over the last several months. We're super proud that we were able to provide them with the tools needed to maintain a high level of teaching despite the quick switch to remote learning that everyone experienced. Our guest this morning is here to tell us how she uses her OKIOCAM to great effect in a hybrid learning environment. Having previously taught in Hong Kong and China, she is now a chemistry teacher in Toronto with a great passion for emerging educational technologies. Here joining us live from Toronto, Canada, is Isabella Liu. If you have any questions for Isabella, please type them in the Q&A section and we will answer them at the end. Hello.
Hi.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining us.
thank you for having me, and I can't wait to see what other people have in mind in terms of Q&A. So, without further ado, let me just see if I can share my screen.
I'll talk to you later, okay?
Perfect. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. So before I start, I just wanted to thank you all so much for joining me on a Friday morning. That just goes to show how committed you are to potentially changing the way you're approaching teaching and learning to make sure that you can find different ways to make sure that teaching and learning is more authentic despite the circumstances. So before I start, I just really wanted to thank you for being here for this webinar. So as Michael has very much done in his introduction, that I am a science teacher and I teach high school science as well as chemistry. And so I'm just going to be talking a little bit about my experience with using OKIOCAM in my classroom. So in our current school, I teach grades 7 to 12 science and then senior level chemistry. I'm also the ed tech integrator in our school, which essentially is just empowering teachers to be more familiar with the tools that they're given to make sure that teaching and learning is more seamless and authentic. I'm also an Apple Distinguished Educator as well as Google for Education trainer and educator. So you can find me in all the socials at the Isabella Liu. So feel free to reach out to me after this webinar if you have any question as to how to use certain things, especially with the OKIOCAM. So just a little description of how my school has decided to approach pandemic teaching and learning. So obviously we have the in-person and the online teaching model, and our school initially had adopted to a hybrid model, but what is really happening is more of a high flex model in the sense where our students get to pick and choose when they decide to come into class and when they decide to be at home to tune into the lesson. Regardless of the model, in terms of the teacher, we're constantly live streaming our lesson to ensure that our students are tuning in wherever they are, whether they are in person or they're online. So as far as the way we are changing our teaching, it feels like we are very much just constructing an online course because we want to make sure how the remote students are tuning in. So even though the students are in person, it is very much like an online school. So this is basically what my teaching setup looks like. All of our tables are spaced out equally distanced, and then we have so I have my camera and I have like a mic, and then I have the monitor that essentially projects to the classroom, and then the OKIO cam very nicely tucks into my right. So this is basically how I set up for my lesson. As you can see, so if we do like a simple visible thinking routine over here, it's like, what do you see? What do you think? And what do you potentially wonder? If I was another teacher and I came in, I would just be like, well, there's so many screens that are happening. Like, how can you ensure that you keeping track of all these three screens, right? You're writing your note here, you're keeping track of the chat box that's happening, and you're also projecting some form of information for the students. So there's a lot of screen, and in terms of the way the students are accessing the information, everything is not exactly tangible. I'm sure that you also have found the same experience so far, is that it's really hard to make those real life connections for our students when everything essentially is virtual, right? The note is no longer a paper note because we want to minimize contact tracing. And so everything is electronic. Even the course material that the students have access to is also electronic. And so what I have felt that was really helpful for me is the OKIOCAM. So in terms of science teaching and learning, what's really important is that we have our concept and we want the students to connect to that concept, and what's helping them to connect with that concept is experiments. And so with students having that flexible model of coming into class whenever they feel comfortable, they may not be able to conduct experiments at the right time or asynchronously. So how can we as science teachers make sure that they are forming the same form of understanding through without the use of labs? So OKIOCAM has allowed me to do that in a very neat way that essentially gives the students a front row seat in their science classroom. So there are certain challenges that I've experienced in my classroom. In addition to having in person, they're actually divided into two cohorts. So I have cohort A, cohort B. So whenever I have to do a lab, I have to make sure that I have sufficient amount for the two cohorts who are coming in person. In addition to that, I have remote students. So then the question is, how can we make sure that their experience when it comes to experiments is an equitable one? How can we make sure that they do understand exactly what are the potential pitfalls that are happening in an experiment, and how can they mitigate those pitfalls if they were to do an experiment? So why OKIOCAM? Now, just so you know, like this is how it looks like. I just wanted to show you how compact it was. So what initially attracted me to this is that when we first transitioned online last term, I was really struggling to really show my students what I was trying to describe to them. I could draw things obviously very easily on a tablet, but in terms of like a simple show and tell, I was really lacking because I was only merely showing things in front of the webcam, but that provides a very different perspective than what a document camera could. And OcuCam was one of those document camera that I came across that was so compact and so inconspicuous. Like when you see it as a teacher, you wouldn't sort of really pitch it as like a document camera. And we know, in terms of my experience, when it came to document cameras, they were just very clunky and then very heavy, and it's really hard for me to be mobile at that point in time. So that's why I love this. That's why I came across OcuCam, and it's really easy to set up, and it's minimal installation. And what I really liked about it is that at that point in time, they had a really neat Google Chrome plugin. So all my files that I've recorded and take photos of, it immediately gets imported into my Google Drive, and I can just simply place them into my Google Docs or Google Slide whenever I need to. Essentially, it's very easy to set up, and what's great about the little arm is that you can actually zoom in for a macro view. You can also tilt the camera for a webcam view, and I'll show you how high quality the images that they create is. Essentially, I often just use the laptop mode, and that's because I have to use a lot of and I use them mostly for experimental setup. And with chemistry, there's a lot of chemicals that we play around with. I don't exactly want it to stain the platform that it has. So I use that to perform science demos. And what's great about it, it essentially just changes the perspective that the students have in terms of accessing something that is completely intangible and virtual to something that's real in a very different perspective. And instead of just sort of having a show and tell where they see my face and see me showing them in front of the camera, now they are immersed into the experiment setup. And I have found personally, since I've started deploying my experiments this way, where I first show them exactly how to set it up using the OcuCam, and before having my in-person students do the experiments, they are a lot more confident when it comes to approaching new equipment or potential other new procedures that they're not familiar with. So in terms of my in-person students, I found that with my OcuCam is very much empowering them because they're able to sort of visually make those connections from reading a procedure to actually seeing it done. And in terms of my online students, I'm able to sort of create videos for them on the side where they can just watch it on their own time before using their peers' data for data analysis. So for example, over here, I have a video on collision theory. So collision theory is an important concept in chemistry because chemical reactions would not normally occur if our substances are not colliding at the correct geometry. Now that's very difficult for students to sort of conceptualize it. They understand the concept very well, but in terms of applying it to a real life context, they often find it hard to understand what that factor means. So in this case, we actually have the video showing the effect of surface area to volume ratio and how fast the reaction occurs. Normally, I would have to do this as a demo with students crowded around my lab table. And oftentimes, you know that when you're a teacher and you have students crowding you, there's always going to be some students who can't see it. So with the OKIOCAM, I'm able to sort of redo this demo over and over again. I can do this live or I can do it recorded. The reason why I recorded this is because then I used this video in one of my assessments where I just didn't have anything. There was no words. It was just simply describing them. This is what's happening. And then ask the students to explain what do you think is being explained here? What's the factor that's being analyzed here? And why do you think this is happening? Apply what you know about collision theory. And as you can see, aside from that glare when that was happening with the iron wool, the OKIOCAM was still able to capture how the experiment was working, especially when it came to trying to test out a ball of steel wool. You will still see that, yes, the reaction is occurring, but it's not actually going. And so that was definitely something that I had not come across with other types of document camera or even with just a simple webcam. And again, I was able to do this because I could just do it on a lab bench without feeling that I was going to like contaminate anything. So this was a great way for me to use OKIOCAM. So following in the same vein of collision theory, we also have another type of experiment. Again, it is also done as a demo. In this case, students wouldn't be able to analyze this at home if they were just tuning in at home. The effect of concentration of hydrochloric acid with magnesium metal. Again, if this was done live where students are crowding around the lab bench, they would only be able to see what's happening on the side. They wouldn't really be able to see exactly what's happening with the experiment because in this experiment, a lot of gas is being produced. And if the students are just sort of seeing it on the side, they wouldn't be able to see because all they see is like a piece of metal that's been floating around the solution. And with the perspective that OKIOCAM gives, my student is able to sort of see, oh, hey, if the solution is producing more gas, then it's more concentrated. So the beaker on the left is clearly more concentrated than the beaker on the right. And why is that? And again, just applying collision theory, they can then easily explain this. So as you can see, again, it is also extremely high quality. And what I love about it is that there is no, like I can stop and edit the videos whenever I need. And it's just great because with the Chrome plugin, I can save all these files onto the cloud on my Google Drive, and I don't have to actually take up space in my laptop. And because we are a Google school, it's a lot easier for me to share these videos to my students if they're already in the drive where I don't have to upload it beforehand. So these are all done under normal classroom light settings. What I really wanted to show you as well is OKIOCAM works really, really well under low light as well. So again, this is another demo that I often do in class, but again, it's really hard for my students online to see if I were to do it using a webcam. And so I just recorded this for them to demonstrate the effect of temperature on the brightness of the glow stick. So as you can see, I have two glow sticks. I've just cracked them and they're they're relatively the same brightness. So I placed them in two different beakers. As you can see on the left is the beaker with ice cubes, and then the beaker on the right is slightly hotter temperatured water. So I just kept it there for a while, and then I took it out to then demonstrate how the brightness of the glow stick is affected by the temperature of the solution. So and nothing was going off in terms of like the lighting. As you can see, every time I click record, OKIOCAM would do an initial adjustment to see like what you're trying to focus on. So it's really smart that way, where you don't actually have to like teach it to focus on anything, because it automatically does that. It also has an automatic button. If you change the perspective, you simply just have to press a button and it auto focuses for you as well. So yeah, as we are taking this out, and then you can see very easily that the glow stick on the right is significantly brighter than the glow stick on the left. And you can see the part where it's not submerged in the ice cube is also brighter. And that's a very good demonstration for my students to see, especially for the ones who are at home, to really understand these various factors that affect the rate of a reaction. So that's essentially is how I've used OKIOCAM in my classroom. And as I've mentioned before, since the usage of OKIOCAM in my classroom, I can see that my students are a lot more confident when it comes to doing experiment, especially my in-person students. And I with that in mind, my students are able to create a lot more acceptable data within the acceptable range. Their lab skills are also improved as a result, because they're a lot more confident when it comes to approaching things, because I have gone through the steps and show them how you're supposed to do. In terms of the conceptual understanding, it is also done at a higher level. And I've seen that in both the in-person as well as remote students. And I can see that in their lab reports or as in their assessments. And in terms of mitigating particular errors, because in our assessments, we have application type questions where I sort of borrow some of the stuff that they would normally see in a lab and ask the students, what went wrong? Why do you think it went wrong? How would you have fixed this? I could see a lot more higher order responses coming from both sets of students, the remote as well as in person. And I really think it's because I'm able to provide them with a different perspective and a different way of accessing the information that is not just YouTube or me showing them via webcam, but rather like that bird's eye view has really been helpful for them to understand what is happening in the science classroom. So I really hope that this has been useful for you. And so some of the questions that I've asked myself when it comes to adopting new tools as well as new ways of teaching is, how are you teaching science during the pandemic? And how might you use the OKIOCAM in your classroom? And how are you teaching science, and is also ensuring that every student has an equitable experience when it comes to experiments? So those are the three questions that hopefully will get you start thinking and potentially brainstorming about different ways that you can use OKIOCAM, because this is obviously just one way that I've been doing in my classroom and it's really resonated with my students. And so I would be curious to see what other ways that you can see yourself using OKIOCAM. And that's the end of my presentation. And I'm sure that you have some questions that hopefully I'm able to answer. Thank you.
Hey again, Isabella. Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure all the attendees enjoyed it as well.
Thank you.
So like Isabella said, we will answer some questions here. So if you have any, type them in the Q&A section for us and we will get to them. So while the presentation was going, I saw that Sonia Goodman had a question for you. She asks, have you used any other doc cams? Can you compare them? So have you used any other document cameras other than the OKIOCAM?
I have, but I've used I think it's called the Ladybug doc cam, and obviously that is also quite small and like easy to take around between classrooms. But what I found is that it's not as compact. So like you still have to sort of lift it by the neck to bring it around. And I also felt like it wasn't as clear in terms of the images. So like for me, what was really important is to make sure that my students who are online could also have like an HD visual at the same time. So yeah, thanks, Sonia.
Yeah,
D.
thank you, Sonia. So Sandy Orwell asked, do you think document cameras make chemistry classes safer? So I guess maybe students don't have to get near to the chemicals. So I guess, would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. And so one way that I've also ensured that my remote students are following the experiment, in addition to sort of watching what my videos, is that they are also tuning in with like their peers. So like everybody would have their camera set up, and also like would they have their Zoom meet basically, and they are showing it to their online students with OKIOCAM. Because of the way the camera could move, it could like tilt to the person who's presenting. It could also tilt downward with the bird's eye view. My students prefer using that rather than their built-in webcam from their laptop, because then they would have to tilt it at a particular angle to really see how the experiments is done, and then they also have to be typing. And oftentimes I feel like it's a lot easier if we had just had an OKIOCAM for every group, and then students are just projecting that, and they don't need to touch anything, because essentially they could see the experimenter and they can also see the experiment at the same time. So yeah, for sure, I think the document cameras are like, especially with OKIOCAM, is definitely making my class safer.
Excellent. That's great to hear. Really cool. So I can see it looks like we have a question typed into the regular chat. So Pete says, are there aspects of this hybrid learning approach that we should try to retain after the pandemic is over?
Yeah, I for sure. I think the fact that, so I don't really know what other people's lesson times are like, but in the non-pandemic version of my lesson, I only have 75 minutes, and currently I have 5 hours for my lesson. So obviously, I have a lot more time and space to explain what the lab is about, but I am keeping that in mind when we are transitioning back to post-pandemic, and is to essentially just break down the labs into 2 separate days and having space for that. So like then instead of just having 5 or 10 minutes where you just say like, okay, watch out for these and these, I would actually make time to explain to my students using OKIOCAM to really demo with the students, because it's easier to explain, like it's easier for them to visually grasp what's happening versus then you telling them something, because it's so easy for the students to just listen and then completely forget what you have told them. And so
Yeah.
that's one aspect that I really wanted to retain after that, and ensuring that the lab days are 2 days would allow my students to have that space and the time for them to complete the lab in a safer way, instead of just trying to have all my students conduct the lab at the same time. So yeah, thanks Pete.
Yeah, thank you, Pete, for the question. That was really cool. Hope that answers your question. We'll take one more question. Sandy, from either groups of students.
Yeah, so I have recently just finished my semester, and I have asked for feedback. And in terms of the way they have found it so far, I mean, even just as a general consensus, is that they found it very helpful to just see everything,
Yeah.
like walk through. Like obviously they understand that the pacing is really fast, like obviously because our curriculum right now is condensed. But in terms of like the experience for both groups of students, like the in-person as well as the remote, as the feedback is that they don't feel like their experience is jeopardized. Because initially I was really worried that my remote students were feeling that they were being left out because they were not participating in the experiments. But from what I've gathered is that the remote students don't feel like they are at a disadvantage at all from the in-person students, because of the setup that we have in our school. So I took that as like a positive, and hopefully we can just continue that for the remainder of the year for the rest of my students.
Okay, so I know that was the last question, but Pete's just typed another comment I can see, just kind of piggybacking off that previous question. He says, I know you try your very best to give your in-classroom and virtual learners the same experience. Do you believe you've achieved this, though?
Yeah, I definitely think I have. And obviously, it's not a perfect solution. And I think we're all just trying to fine tune this because there's no template that teachers have that would have prepped us for the pandemic. And I think what I've done so far and all the various changes and pivoting that I've done in my classroom, I really think that I have achieved this. So giving space for both in person as well as online and ensuring that they both have access to the material in different ways allows me to make sure that their experience is equitable.
Okay, that's very cool. And it's super cool that you were able to use OKIOCAM to
Yeah,
do
no,
that and
thank you
achieve
so
that.
much for giving me that. And because I was able, like, I'm so happy that I've stumbled upon OKIOCAM because without it, I don't think I would be able to really do my labs as well.
Excellent. That's
Yeah.
really cool to hear. Okay, so thank you, all the attendees, for joining us. Thank you for the really cool questions as well. That was
Thank
really
you.
interesting. Thank you so much, Isabella, for giving us the talk. Okay, it was a pleasure to listen to you. I will talk soon. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. And
Bye-bye.
send me a message if you have any questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.